operate in strictest secrecy at the cutting edge of Australia's defence. They're creative, unorthodox and comfortable in chaos. For over 50 years, the Australian SAS has put their lives at risk, deep behind enemy lines. This is the only television history ever supported by this highly secretive regiment. We take you beyond the stereotypes to reveal the unexpected story of the real people who transformed SAS from the ugly duckling of the Australian Army into pride of place as Australia's force of first choice. In the early 1980s, although its Vietnam War had been over for 10 years, the Australian SAS regiment still anticipated jungle wars in Asia and the arc of instability. But with no active service likely, some soldiers left to seek adventure, their own business, family life or travel. In line with the official Fortress Australia defence posture and to maintain combat readiness for regional conflicts, SAS continued to develop the 3 green or war roles for inserting small groups into areas of operations. These advanced skills were polished to a very high standard. Parachuting is a familiar method of insertion of troops. After passing the SAS selection course, all successful candidates have to pass the basic parachute course to be accepted into the regiment. After rigorous ground training in exiting the jump aircraft and landing without injury, soldiers then complete 8 static line jumps from 300 metres, including jumping at night and jumping with heavy equipment. There were dangers. When parachutists exited both side doors of the Hercules aircraft at the same time, if their exits weren't properly staggered, their canopies could tangle and they could plunge to their deaths. After the basic parachute course, soldiers could apply for free fall. Free falling can provide a silent approach to a target that is difficult for an enemy to detect.
Scared, Ken?
Learning to free fall used to be learning by doing.
Sports parachutists would be taken to 2,000 feet or 2,500 feet and they'd be taught how to exit the aircraft. We were taken to 10,000 feet and just thrown out and to sort ourselves out quick smart. The sky, the ground, the sky, the ground, the sky, the ground, and you just tumbled, sink or swim, and that's possibly the best way to describe it.
But now the beginner is closely supervised to master stabilising in the 3 axes of the body: longitudinal, vertical and horizontal. This takes skill and practice. Ripcord height is indicated by the free faller's altimeter. Once stability is learnt, free fallers can manoeuvre easily, first grouping in free fall so that they can group quickly on the ground, ready for action. Horizontal tracking using the delta position can avoid a parachute opening under a comrade still in free fall, which is likely to result in fatal entanglement of both. For long free fall insertions at night, small backpack lights help keep the team together and avoid free falling into a parachute opening below you.
I can recall night jumps where it's been that black. You've opened your parachute and you cannot see anyone around you, and you know There is 6 or 7 other fellows in the sky with you who are supposed to open at the same altitude. On a very black night, I landed, knocked the wind out of me because I couldn't see the ground coming up. And as I lay there trying to get my wits about me, I heard flap, 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 flap. And there's a guy landed about 5 or 6 feet from me, so he must have been travelling right next to me in the sky there somewhere, and we just didn't see each other.
Although Rasmussen was a freefall instructor with almost 1,000 parachute jumps to his name, he found some parachuting tasks could be irksome.
Nobody liked jumping combat equipment. We were often very uncomfortable and really found it difficult standing, let alone walking, to the edge of the ramp. It was hard work and scary.
I've got to be honest, I hated parachuting. It wasn't my favourite thing. You know, the old saying is that every jump for me was a night jump, because every time I left that plane my eyes were closed.
Accuracy of insertion was much harder with the old, sluggish hemispherical canopy, where air vents could provide only a very steep glide angle, slow left and right turning, and slight braking and slowing of descent. Although parachute malfunctions are rare, parachutists are trained for them. In all cases of malfunction, the freefaller must assess his altitude and act promptly. A wildly unstable freefall can lead to tumbling and becoming entangled in your own canopy after pulling the ripcord. Rarely the canopy will stream and won't fully inflate. This soldier's pilot chute is being fouled by its own attachment line and restrained by the partial vacuum above his backpack. But he has been trained for this. He still has altitude, so he waits and it opens. This soldier's canopy has partly failed as it bunches up at the back. He has to decide quickly whether to release from it, go back into freefall, and open his reserve parachute.
We had the introduction of ram air parachutes, which by definition then forced the regiment to consider new air insertion methods.
Probably the main method of insertion at that time was probably by halo parachuting techniques. Halo, high altitude, low opening parachuting. A group of Special Force soldiers or a patrol of Special Force soldiers would be taken by aircraft to 30,000+ feet with the aid of oxygen, inserted some miles away from your target, free fall to anything above 2,000 feet, deploy your main parachute and hopefully land on your target. Now hey-ho, like halo, in the sense that it was high altitude, high opening, as opposed to high altitude, low opening. Now high opening parachuting would mean that an aircraft would fly 25,000 feet and above, certainly operationally above 30,000 feet. You'd leave the aircraft with oxygen. No sooner you left the aircraft, you would then deploy your parachute. Your parachute would be open at approximately 30,000 feet, and then you would drift in with the aid of navigation aids to your target, which could be 20 to 30 kilometres away, whereby you could exit the aircraft in one country and fly to another under a parachute and more than likely not be detected.
Another important green war role to be intensively developed was water operations.
In order to develop the water operations capability, SAS turned to the Royal Marines in the United Kingdom Special Boat Squadron. And in doing so, essentially picked up the basic, intermediate and advanced courses that the Royal Marines used to train the Special Boat Service personnel and brought it back to Australia.
Basically water-based targets or canoes and that you actually go off the coast or get dropped off and come back in to a land target. We're about to do beach surveys, things like that, so you're looking at landing areas. So you'd practice coming in over the horizon in a canoe or a Zodiac, land at the beach, do a prep, have a look at it, so you can report back. So it was practicing that reconnaissance sort of role. Also doing attacks on small targets. And I remember on one exercise down at Albany, we actually had to canoe in down a river. It was freezing cold, it was the middle of winter, so we got onto this river. It was fantastic, except no one forgot to tell us it was only 6 inches deep. We basically towed those canoes for about 5 k's, and they froze our nuts off, and we nearly got hypothermia.
They also trained to unload collapsible Zodiacs from submarines, which they could tow to the surface and inflate, ready to move off on their mission. In float-on, float-off insertions, Zodiacs are inflated on the deck of a submarine lying out of sight over the horizon, floating off as the submarine submerges. After completing its mission, the Zodiac is floated on again as the submarine surfaces. It is then deflated and stowed back in the submarine. In other scenarios, inflated Zodiacs and other equipment were parachuted into the water with assaulting parachutists, ready for use. Water operators also began using high-speed rigid inflatable boats, which enabled speed and attack, and they practiced the dangerous skill of boarding and seizing ships underway. SAS water operators also trained in advanced diving skills.
The SAS dive course was probably for me almost more challenging than selection. It was in its own way a second selection course. 3 dives a day, some are fairly long duration, with PT thrown in the morning, with a few hours sleep each night.
The diving course consisted of 5 weeks, 2.5 weeks using self-contained breathing gear with air, and then the rest of the time was all on closed circuit rebreathing systems with pure oxygen mix. The changeover from scuba gear to the rebreathers was a pretty interesting time, and most people came out of their first dive saying, what the hell is going on? Because instead of with scuba gear where the air is pressurised and you get a positive blast of air in, for rebreathing you have to physically exhale into a counter lung and inflate that, and the total opposite way of breathing was quite different. And so the first dives they did were generally safe dives with shallow depth and of a short duration, so guys could get used to the diving. Once you got used to it though, you found that you could work extremely hard because your body was super saturated with oxygen and you could swim quite hard for a long time, which is required, especially when you're diving in Bass Strait or doing forced swims.
In 1990, the end of 1990, I was lucky enough to be picked to be the Australian exchange to the Special Boat Service, or the SBS, of the Royal Marines in the United Kingdom. The Royal Marines are part of the Royal Navy, so for 2 years I carried a Royal Navy ID card, so I got to be a sailor for 2 years.
The Special Boat Service, or SBS, is regarded as the Royal Marines commando equivalent of the British SAS. The SBS was first raised in World War II and was remarkably successful in seaborne attacks on German and Italian units in the Greek islands and throughout the Mediterranean. By any standards, the SBS is regarded as one of the toughest and most astute of the world's special forces.
The SBS conducts, as well as CT, water operations, diving, desert warfare, jungle warfare, urban warfare, and conventional warfare in the sense of being a reconnaissance force for the rest of the Royal Marines. The highlights were being able to get back into the jungle, which I enjoy, and things I found extremely difficult was working in Norway in winter. Within the Australian SAS, it's the free-fall troops that train their soldiers in Arctic warfare or mountain warfare. So it was a very sharp learning curve for a water op soldier from Australia who hadn't seen that much snow to be skiing around Norway with a very, very large, heavy pack, and a rifle that every time I fell over, the magazine would jam up under my ribs.
I worked in Norway for 3 months with the Special Boat Service and the Royal Marines doing my Arctic warfare training, and there are a number of occasions when trying to battle my way up mountains, whether it was on skis with a massive pack or pushing up skidoos, which were the sort of vehicle that we used to travel around the snow, through very difficult conditions and terrain where it easily overshadowed any of the physical tasks that I was given on selection. Certainly my time in operations, where I had far less sleep than I actually gained during selection, less food, under a great deal more pressure because I was making decisions that related to the lives of the men that I had around me. I did my icebreaking activities with 4-5 Royal Marine Commando as part of my build-up with SBS. Icebreaking drills, generally if it's for training you go about cutting a hole in it. What you don't want to do is actually break ice the conventional way, which is usually by falling into it. So usually what you do is fight your way out to an edge, try and overcome the cold. There's always that instant shock of hitting very, very cold water, and then trying to lift yourself out onto the snow, rolling around a bit to get the snow to absorb the water, and then try and change your clothes and warm up as quickly as possible. One interesting thing for me was after completing the icebreaking drills and rolling around in the snow and getting quite cold and getting into the warming tent, in good old British fashion you had an option to drink either some warm cordial or some warm rum, and so I lined up for my shot of warm rum, and there were a string of young Royal Marine Commandos coming behind me who wouldn't drink their rum at all, so I asked if I could have their shots as well. So after having about 6 shots of Royal Navy rum, I found I was skiing the best I've ever skied after that for the 5-kilometre ski out. I loved my time training in the snow in Norway, very much for the same reasons I probably enjoyed my selection course. Every time I found other people having difficulty in the snow, it tended to buoy me, and my sadistic streak used to come out again because I started enjoying it more when other people found it even harder.
The close relationship of SAS with the Royal Marines Commando Special Boat Service is also maintained with the United States Navy SEALs.
As with operating with SAS, operating with the SEALs was a buzz. It was always busy. We operated by day and by night, and nobody knew what day of the week it was, or at some times where we were. We operated both in the desert out east of San Diego, we operated in the snow in Colorado, and ultimately in the ice and the snow of Alaska, and in the chain of islands that runs from Alaska out towards the Soviet Union, as it was then known. Our operations consisted of operating with submarines, marrying up at sea with submarines by free fall or static line parachute from a variety of US aircraft, and the submarine might not surface initially, but we would sit bobbing around in the ocean, perhaps in a rubber boat, perhaps just as swimmers, and ultimately we would marry up with the submarine, which might then involve a subsurface lock into the submarine. The submarine would surface and we'd lock in, and then transit for some distance. In addition to operating with submarines though, we operated with some of the US Navy surface fleet.
There is a bit of a subculture within the regiment that's referred to as the SAS Water Ops Mafia. Generally quite extroverted A-type personalities, very, very fit by the nature of being Special Forces divers, and very, very headstrong. Probably one of the aspects that contributed to this lexicon of the SAS Water Mafia, or this perception that there was a culture based on water operators. There are limitations in terms of passing the medical, in terms of your fitness. You had to have lungs that worked properly and would work as a diver, and when I say that, that's no sort of defects or issues related to your lungs, whereas for vehicle mounted troops or for even for freefallers who also had to go through a different regime, there were different physical fitness standards. So that probably contributed to some of the aspect of, and I don't want to use the word elitism, but certainly selectiveness in who went to a water operations troop. There were still a few guys who smoked. They invariably tended to be the fittest blokes out of the troop as well, which was a massive annoyance to those non-smokers of us that kept on getting beaten on runs and dives by these individuals. They always reckoned that it actually helped them with their fitness.
One time we were going ashore, deploying from a submarine off Melville Island, about 92 I think, and we were tossing up whether to use Zodiacs or canoes, and we eventually decided on the Zodiacs, which is fortunate because as we approached shore at first light, we were pursued by a large, angry, probably female crocodile whose territory we'd strayed into. We sped off, breaking all the noise rules, and eventually slowed down, and only to find that she was still pursuing us. It must have played on my mind, and the others realised this, because a couple of days later, lying in my sleeping bag in the morning, before I got up, a couple of them dived on the bag, grabbed me by the legs, and apparently I jumped almost clean out of the bag, which amused them for the rest of the week.
This is when I was a subaltern in the SAS in my first year, and I was sent up north in my SAS platoon. We went up by a Navy frigate and we dropped off on at various little points on the coastline to build helicopter pads for the surveyors to map the northwest of WA. It used to be my habit at the end of each working day to go out with one of my soldiers in a little rubber Zodiac to get some fish. And we were fishing about 150 metres offshore in this mangrove type water up to about the waist as it was, when I heard my mate, John Sexton, who's passed away now, say, "Hey Sarah, I think I can see a crocodile." And I took no notice because I was pulling in a fish at the time. And suddenly Sexton gives a big yell and he jumps overboard, and I look up to see this whacking great sea crocodile climbing on board our little rubber Zodiac. So I jump overboard, and there the two of us in the water, and the crocodile just sat there in the boat because we had the anchor down and we had to get our boat back to shore. So I said to Sexton, "Who's going to pull up the anchor?" And he very rightly and promptly said, "You're the officer, sir." And it taught me a good lesson. You're the officer, sir. So I had to go around to the bow of the boat and pull up this anchor, looking into the face of a 10 or 11 foot sea crocodile from about 3 foot distance. And I pulled up the anchor and we pushed the boat into shore. The crocodile jumped out of the back of the boat, started to swim up and down the little berg. We couldn't relaunch our boat, so we made up a plastic explosive charge with a 4-second fuse and a detonator and threw it out and blew the crocodile out of the water.
The third Green War role was vehicle mounted, later to be used extensively in Afghanistan and Iraq.
The reason I had to change from water operations to vehicle mounted was down at Garden Island in 1986. I made medical history by getting the bends in the recompression chamber when we were doing simulated dive to experience the effects of nitrogen narcosis.
I wasn't into freefall. It wasn't my kettle of fish, but I had to be a parachutist in order to be in the regiment, so we did it, although I didn't like it. I specifically took up the non-diving and parachute courses. The old saying was a second-class ride's better than a first-class walk, so I decided to go vehicle mounted. In the early days of vehicle mounted, we had absolutely nothing. They threw us a standard Land Rover and said, "You're now vehicle mounted, away you go."
When I first joined the regiment, the cars that we were given were the original old Land Rovers with 4 wheels, and they were shocking. These things were held together by rubber bands and dried up Vegemite, I think. In that period where there wasn't really much happening in the world, vehicle mounted was probably the ugly cousin.
The standard Land Rover couldn't travel the distances and carry the personnel with equipment, so we decided we had to change it. So we threw on extra jerry cans of water, fuel, and I think the first big move was when they produced a 100-gallon petrol tank which actually sat in the back of the vehicle behind the 2 seats.
We went back to the drawing boards, down to the unit library, or 5MD library, pulled out every book on LRDG, SAS in the Desert 1942 that we could get our hands on, read them up, looked at what they'd done, relearnt the lessons to the extent of getting the sun compass. We fabricated a sun compass. We looked at reinstigating astronavigation, which was a serious challenge, and some serious mathematics was involved, even though we did have the advantage of the calculator.
Good navigation is vital, but astronavigation and the sun compass would never replace the basic infantry skill of navigating by compass bearing and distance travelled, calculated by averaging the paces counted by 2 soldiers.
So there are a lot of old skills, particularly navigation, driving, desert driving, vehicle modifications, that had to be relearned. We improvised condensers. We started from scratch pretty much.
To allow the 2 machine guns freedom of movement, the windscreens and canopies were removed.
We actually had to get around and make our own gun mounts. We had an M60 mounted on the back of the vehicle and an M60 mounted on the front for the passenger. And those gun mounts were made by ourselves, by just sitting together, talking about it, and we used tyre rod ends, would you believe, as a swivel. And I've still got an army jumper at home with burn marks in the sleeve, which on a Sunday I was using an arc welder to weld up the bloody gun mounts.
We had a huge problem with tyres. We were running the stock standard 4-ply bar tread tyre and puncturing, barely getting outside the gates before getting punctures.
You spend all your time repairing punctures. You change the tyre about 3 times a day through stakes or stones. Torn petrol tanks are the norm while you're hitting rocks.
The vehicles were carrying 2 spare wheels bolted to the front bumper bar, and on one occasion not only did I puncture 2 of the 4 wheels on the vehicle, I also punctured the 2 spare ones bolted to the roof bar on the front. The only unit in the Australian Army at the time which was using anything sensible in that sense from tyres was Survey Corps, who were allowed to buy their own 10-ply tyres off their local Dunlop dealer.
The glamour boys always seem to be the free fallers or the assault swimmers. But I can tell you that life in vehicle mounted is completely miserable. In the heat of summer, you boil in a vehicle. There is no protection from the dust or the flies or the heat. In the depths of winter, even the nights in the desert in summertime, it is bitterly cold. It's totally miserable.
Prior to the introduction of the long-range patrol vehicles, we really focused on driving skills and the capacity to operate in harsh environments over an extended period. And one of the ways that we tested that as a troop was on an extended deployment exercise where we took a number of the Series 2As and basically transported ourselves from Perth all the way up the Canning stock route, which was a challenge both environmentally and mechanically in keeping these vehicles going. Then back down through the Tanami, around Ayers Rock and then back across. One of the features of that activity was the ingenuity and some of the bush mechanical skill sets that the soldiers developed to keep those what were really quite old vehicles at that stage, including opening and using ration tin lids and manufacturing them into washer rings and a number of others just to keep these vehicles going.
The vehicle-mounted troop continued to learn survival off the land from Aboriginal people.
One item that springs to mind that the Indigenous people showed us was candle nuts and how widely they could be used. They could be used as a candle, and they could also be used for a variety of other means. And with the typical initiative of SAS, they certainly were during that exercise. One of the things that our soldiers learnt from the Aboriginals was the use of the pandanus plant. We used the texture of its bark for shelter. We used the water that you could gain from beneath the plant and from within its root system as sustenance, and obviously parts of the plant could also be used for food sustenance.
On the survival course, you're taught to how to survive without any equipment in the rough. You're taught to catch a cobra. Yeah. How to cook a tarantula and a scorpion. So you eat all those things. You eat rat. You get to eat boiled animal blood. Anything that's got any nutrition, you'll eat it. If you're going to prepare something you catch, out in the wild. For example, with a scorpion, you'll have to take the stinger off, and there's a sac that you take out. The tarantula you prepare similarly, and you can either eat it the way it is, or you can crush it up with the bones and all, take all the good offal in there, and you can even stick a gum leaf in there when you cook it just to flavour it a little bit differently, and things like that. With rats, they're everywhere, of course. They'll come to you if you're laying on the ground, so they're not hard to catch. You prepare them in a similar way and only eat the meat and cook it well. You can smoke the meat, and if you smoke the meat, you can keep it in your pocket for a few days, so you've got a bit of a meal on the run.
Just like to take this opportunity to show you what sort of things you can find out here when you're on the bush, doing it hard, vehicle mounted style. Come over and have a look over here, see what we can find. If you look along the sides of river banks, and you can dig certain depths. This is good brown dirt, but however, there's a few nicer things that grow here in the lantana. Look at that, look at that! And oh, here it comes. Look at this. Look at that. Look at that.
Vehicle-mounted SAS also carried trail bikes to extend their reconnaissance range. They had to learn to use motorcycles in desert country, on and off roads.
Get on, I Nice control in the get on.
One exercise that I reflect upon is exercise built on Watcher, which occurred in mid-1982. It was an operation run out of bush camp that we built out of the scrub west of Darwin. The people who deployed from that site went to some 18 different locations throughout Queensland, obviously the Northern Territory, as far south as Oodnadatta in South Australia, and included the Kimberley. The average distance from our base camp was 1,500 kilometres. They inserted through a variety of means, sometimes parachute, sometimes ship drop-off. At times they drove and rode motorbikes to their target area. Often they walked. It was a significant challenge in a hot, dry environment. One patrol that failed to make it back to its rendezvous where it was to meet its parent vehicle to return it to Delisaville in the Territory, walked 1,500 kilometres back to our base camp. They lived off the land as they moved, and they did a sterling effort in making it back. I think that single commitment reflects the do-or-die attitude of SAS soldiers.
We used to do these long-range communication exercises to test our communications. We would have patrols going to the north, to the west, and down south in Western Australia. But I guess being typical Australians, we didn't like this rough style of living, and often we would have selected pubs where we would pull in and put the vehicles. We would set the radio set up in a bar, and we would send our messages back to base, often doing things by shortening the aerials to distort the signals, to provide weak signals and this type of thing. And a number of occasions we had a lot of the locals, in fact, trained to send Morse code. In fact, we used to send the Morse code back while we used to enjoy the odd ale. And you had a Land Rover and you had a bloody trailer full of rations for a week or whatever. You know, who the hell wants to go out in the bush and get cold and wet and all this sort of thing when you can sit there and watch television or go down the beach and have a swim and just send the odd radio sked here and say, oh, we've moved another 300 kilometres up the road. And they used to be amazed at the distance we used to get for these things. We weren't all that far apart. I mean, I'm sure some guys did genuinely do it, but a lot of us didn't.
Eventually we got the new six-wheel cars, and it was going from the Mini Minor to the Rolls Royce, and we were thrilled. They did have their shortcomings, but from our point of view they were bloody great.
It was designed to sustain the patrol group who were operating from extended periods, whether it was 10 days, 20 days, 30 days. In some instances though, we focused on using them in short, sharp, strategic striking type operations where you might drive in and drive out in a shorter time frame.
It took a lot of training and a lot of ability to drive those things very quietly in a hostile region to get as close as you possibly could in the quietest fashion you could possibly drive that vehicle. We would always make sure that we disconnected horns and isolated all the headlights and hazard lights and everything else, and pulled the flaps down over those just in case.
Right through the 70s and 80s, despite the absence of any particular meaningful operation that the SAS could have got involved in and didn't, the guys there just took everything to its absolute maximum that they could. So things like the long-range patrol vehicle techniques and the long-range patrol vehicle itself as a platform were developed out of those long, desperate years of trying to find meaning.
With no active service, SAS soldiers devised their own adventures: mountain climbing, trekking, canoeing and sports parachuting. The SAS Climbing Wing, which had been formed in 1971, specialised in mountaineering, climbing and survival techniques. This gave SAS soldiers the skills to take on extremely challenging climbs. In 1980, Lieutenant Jim Truscott and Lieutenant Mike Hindmarsh climbed the remote, formidable Ball's Pyramid, which rises steeply from the ocean south of Lord Howe Island. Risking shark attack in mountainous seas, they swam ashore, floating in their equipment in 44-gallon drums. It rained steadily for the entire 3-day climb, but they made it to the peak. Jim Truscott's many climbs included Ganesh 4 in the Himalayas. He was lucky to escape an avalanche that killed his companion. By 1990, SAS soldiers had climbed many challenging peaks, including Mount Kilimanjaro, the Matterhorn and Mount Everest. During Australia's bicentenary, the Great Australian Camel Race was staged, possibly the longest animal endurance race ever held. A staggering 3,000 kilometres long, the race started at Ayers Rock and moved east across vast deserts to finish at Queensland's Gold Coast. Among the competitors was an SAS team.
And it was sold to us who would like to go on an adventure training exercise for 6 months. You know, we were totally naive. We didn't know what was required to train the camels at all. The fellow who was meant to be providing the training didn't provide any training. He was a bit of a shyster, so we ended up starting the race. Some of us couldn't even ride the camels. They'd just throw you straight off. They will bite you, they will kick you, they are belligerent, they won't come to you. With the disciplining of your camel, you don't do it yourself. We didn't know this. So on the lead up to the race, we were belting them crazy with poly pipes, trying to get them to do things for us. You know, camels have got very, very good memories and they're very intelligent. So we had a bad relationship from the get-go.
The Army has 3 teams in the Great Camel Race, but these blokes are the elite, the Special Air Services, the crack anti-terrorist squad.
69 camels face the starter.
All I wanted to do was beat one bloke in particular who had done the wrong thing by us with the training of the animals. That was the only thing I was worried about at that stage. I couldn't even ride this camel, and all I was going to do was just run as far as I could with it, as long as I stayed in front of this fella, and that was it. The first day I ran 50 kilometres straight up without a break, and when I woke up I was very, very sore. We got to Alice Springs and there was a bit of a carnival atmosphere. You had this boxing troupe there, and Grant C of course got up and took on the Birdsville Mall. Grant belted him to pieces, but obviously he couldn't be seen to have won.
It only happened in the upper. The Birdsville Mall still retains his undefeated status.
It was 3 months being around camels the whole time. You know, I remember some mornings just the noise they make when they're getting up, you know. our strategy was to save the camel as much as we could by running and walking. Some of the times you were walking at night on highways and people were very, very concerned about wearing the pads down on the camels because they had spongy foot or getting it cut open by glass.
Roger, we waited up as long as we could then. Exhaustion must have overcome us, over.
During the 3-month race, competitors and camels had to battle through extremes of temperature and weather, from 40+ degree heat to near zero. The monsoonal wet in the Channel Country was especially wearing.
It was hard the whole way through, and the only time I reckon I felt any form of elation was the last leg from Canungra to the Gold Coast. It was 3 Ks, it was nothing. We were relaxed, guys were riding their camels backwards, we were drinking and swapping camels and just had a laugh. I came in second and a fellow called Steve came in third, and Steve was a fellow who was meant to be providing the training for the SASR team. By the end of the race, I was physically really bloody burnt out. I was just glad to get out of there.
The Australian Bicentenary Camel Race was just one of the many SAS activities that kept fit and imaginative SAS soldiers engaged throughout the long peace after Vietnam. With the advent of international terrorism, SAS now faced a very different enemy. SAS focus shifted from the old green role to the new black role. The new top-secret counter-terrorist, or CT squadron, was quickly created. The CT training had a new dynamic purpose and a sense of urgency and relevance.
A huge debate broke out. Certain state police forces wanted to maintain their own counter-terrorist capabilities. There was an argument that the federal police, like GSG-9 in Germany, should maintain the capability. Others argued it should be in the army, and if it was in the army there was only one place for it, and that was in the SAS regiment. We had to demonstrate that we were the capability of choice.
I think CT saved the regiment a little bit for a start, because prior to that we were still living and training in Vietnam.
Soon after the Hilton bombing and the new focus on counter-terrorism, as a young captain I was sent with an SAS sergeant, Lee Alva, at great haste to Britain to work with the British SAS at Hereford 22 SAS. We worked with their counter-terrorist force and spent months learning the skills that would be needed to then come back to raise, train and equip our own counter-terrorist capability here in Australia. Each tour of Vietnam was like a 12-month gruelling endurance march, punctuated by moments of terror. Counter-terrorism was different. You were training for a sprint. When called on, you'd be out there. It might be over in days. New weapons. Instead of using rifles, we were using submachine guns and pistols. New equipments for method of entry. New vehicles. A completely new battlefield environment. Close quarter combat skills became a top priority over other skills we'd learned in Vietnam for long range reconnaissance and surveillance.
A whole lot of new equipment was introduced, personal equipment, new webbing, new helmets, boots, which to the untrained person, and it's not in the military, one could say, so what? But to a soldier that's running around on the wing of an aircraft or climbing a ladder, trying to assault a ship underway at sea, what you're wearing on your feet and the clothing that you've got on you and the equipment you have can be a matter of life and death.
Government pressure caused training facilities to be hastily designed and built.
We had to build ranges that look like buses, that look like aircraft, that look like embassies, where soldiers could move and fire and close quarter combat live firing could be conducted. Now this was dangerous work, very dangerous work. bullets were flying within centimetres of others.
You had to have very good weapon skill, you had to think on your feet, you had to think quick, you had to do it in noisy environments, smoke-filled environments, and we practiced on aircraft, including live aircraft, though you weren't allowed to shoot. We'd practice in enclosed areas, we'd practice in high-rise buildings, practice jumping off high-rise buildings, rappelling out of helicopters into high-rise buildings, using all sorts of the weaponry of the day.
Airliners are very vulnerable to attack, so the SAS studied the handling of aircraft on the ground to familiarise themselves with the routine of busy airports.
We'd have guys who'd specialise in explosive entries, another guy would specialise in driving, and of course your sergeant would specialise in the planning. We all had mechanical entry skills, which means crash patch, windows, doors, minor explosive skills and things like that, and we'd just practice them at all levels and non-stop.
CT troops spent long hours acquiring deadly accuracy with submachine gun and automatic pistol in a variety of firing scenarios.
We would expect to, probably within 5 to 6 metres, be able to put 2 rounds in rapid pace, basically within an inch of each other. If that weapon went down, you'd have a stoppage, you'd immediately go for your pistol, and you expect to get a similar grouping with that at that distance. It was all short range stuff, and over long range you'd take more time. The reason being is that if they are standing behind a hostage, you need to have to hit them in a very small space, because that's all it's showing.
Some weapons were better than others. Pistols harder. Submachine guns are good, and the SD, the silenced version of the H&K machine pistol, is extremely accurate because of its heavy barrel.
Because one bullet doesn't always immobilise the target, the squadron used watermelons to practice the double tap. 2 quick shots to the forehead to prevent a wounded terrorist from detonating a bomb. SAS CT operations were always strictly subject to the civil law, and this was emphasised in training.
Now, what I used to stress to my soldiers when I commanded the counter-terrorist squadron back in the late 80s is not to become too wrapped round the axles about the legalities of it. Not because it wasn't important, it certainly is, it's absolutely critical. But I had to guard against the soldiers becoming so focused on the legalities that they actually hesitated when the time came for them to be decisive. And all those drills they practice day in, day out, take into account all these legal issues. So if they apply their drills correctly and only engage those people who are offering a threat to them or to the hostages, it means that they'll be covered.
Just as soldiers must have found it hard to adapt from Borneo to Vietnam, I think some of us found it hard to adapt from the Vietnam experience to this new counter-terrorism experience. For others, it was new and it was their opportunity to shine.
The guys teaching us were all Vietnam veterans. Now, not all those guys could even go to CT. They didn't have the accuracy, they didn't have the speed, because they were getting older. It's really, a lot of it's a young man's game. And it's all about controlled aggression as well. It's also about being able to shoot certain targets that some guys refuse to shoot, such as women holding weapons.
Counter-terrorist skills were also needed for offshore terrorist attacks.
The CT roles are mainly for us in water troop, revolved around recovery of offshore facilities such as oil rigs or ships at anchor, and we practice those ceaselessly in Bass Strait and all around the coast of Australia.
We'd looked at certain ways of getting in, whether it was either in submarines, whether it was parachuting, whether it was possible to jump out of a helicopter wearing the LA-5. We tried all of these things, but we come down to boat drop off, and swim in. We soon learned in the Bass Strait it was a very big task, problems there with current, changing weather conditions. We moved to larger, rigid-hulled, inflatable boats, much bigger, much more powerful and better capable of surviving operations out in the Bass Strait. The platforms themselves being covered in a mud grease compound to protect them made it very hard to climb. In those early days, because of the coldness of the water, we did the right thing. We got very thick wetsuits. However, to climb, it quickly made the arms fill with blood, and you could find it very difficult to climb after only a short while. The currents were extremely strong, so to find out how the current was running, we'd put someone in the water, tethered, so just hanging there a shark bait, assessing the drift. Seals could be a problem swimming onto the platforms, if they were to run into you or bite or whatever.
CT assault swimmers also trained to board oil rigs from underwater at night, might launch from a mother craft such as a submerged submarine using rebreather diving gear that emitted no telltale air bubbles. They learnt how to climb from the sea up onto the platform with their weapons.
About 30 SAS members are training at swimming and climbing on the West Kingfish platform south of Lake's entrance. They will remain on the platform for another few days.
The Bass Strait is a fairly unforgiving environment in which to train and operate. Whether it was people suffering from embolisms, whether it was people being killed by a propeller strike from boats.
There were the Wessex helicopters that were used at that particular time for the fellows to get out to the rigs. They weren't very good helicopters, they were quite obsolete. In one case I can recall, we hopped on one, they tried to fire it up. The crew told us we better hop out and hop into another one. We got into that, it took off. We were probably only in the air for a couple of minutes, and we noticed the crew was up in the ceiling there wrapping rags around some piping there where fluid was coming out. We sort of looked at each other and went, well, this doesn't seem quite right. He looked at us and you could see we were a little bit concerned, and we saw that he was also a bit concerned, so consequently we turned around, flew back. Then we got into another helicopter, so that was the third one, and in the third helicopter we finally got out to the rig.
For a time, SAS gave higher priority to the black counter-terrorist role than the green war skills role. The CT squadron became the place to be in SAS, as it was the soldiers' best chance of seeing action during the long peace. But this created a culture in which the green role became the poor relative. The CT squadron began to see itself as more important than the other squadrons.
It did produce an elitism, and that elitism hurt the regiment for a number of years. By elitism, I refer to issues such as soldiers who were, up until that time, great mates and all doing the same job, were all of a sudden not doing the same job within the regiment anymore. So we had mates not talking to mates about what was going on in their day-to-day role within the regiment. We had the counter-terrorist squadron having such an elitist type attitude about their work, maybe we could say utterly professional attitude beyond the norm about their work, that even when they went to do their unarmed combat training in the gymnasium would be locked and no one was allowed in. So I'm not quite sure how the counter-terrorist squadron invented any new forms of kicking or punching that wasn't already available in various instructors' manuals around the military.
While off base, counter-terrorist squadron soldiers had to keep their suitcases packed 24/7. They had to keep their pages with them at all times. They could not take family holidays away from Perth.
It had huge implications for their families, it had huge implications for them, and it put people under a lot of pressure. It was the first time the regiment found itself in a position where soldiers could have to go to war effectively at 4 hours' notice during so-called peace from their Perth base, not while deployed overseas. This was new territory for the regiment.
As global terrorism mushroomed in the 80s, the possibility of SAS soldiers being kidnapped and tortured by terrorists was very real. So SAS taught how to withstand prisoner of war interrogation.
We were captured and made POWs for a 72-hour period before we actually were released back into Campbell Barracks. And it was 3 days of brainwashing, of limited sleep, of not having any clothing, of it being sort of 5 and 6 degrees during the night. We were being punished. I made a few mistakes during my interrogation process and was thrown into a pool with your pillowcase over your head and a noose tied around my waist. And I think I can honestly say that 72 hours of my life is the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. It was harder than 4 weeks of selection.
There was quite a few injuries because of the pace of it. So we lost a few guys to injury over that period of time.
We were down the back one night about to do an entry on a house down there with all the good gear. When we got the word to go, I had this distraction device over my head. I pulled the pin, we got the word go, and as I just released to throw it, pulled the pin, it completely fragged in my hand, like basically a normal hand grenade. The person in front of me was blown over, the person behind me got blown over, and consequently out of that I lost half my hand, which was completely blown away. And I can recall looking down, I had fingers hanging off, and I had other bits and pieces, shrapnel in me, and so forth. I'm not the only person who lost bits and pieces down there. There were guys down there who had bits of their legs blown away, and a good mate of mine, had his half his calf muscle blown off. There are other blokes ended up bits of shrapnel in them. Severe burns, heaps of blokes with broken bones from crashing through doors, hanging on the back of vehicles, falling off.
There was always difficulties working in the environment, and it could prove lethal. In fact, even for myself, just the lead-up training at Garden Island in Western Australia, trying some different tactics. One of the drop-off boats had moved offline and it changed course and ran over me, striking my right hand and degloving, tearing all the skin off the back of the hand. So those type of operations always were fraught.
It was realised, of course, and fully understood that you couldn't stay in the counter-terrorist squadron, as we called it, online, forever and a day. You were going to wear out.
I know one of my soldiers has committed suicide. There have been a number that have sustained and lived with injuries for many, many years. This was operational. It was not peacetime training. I think governments need to remember that the nature of warfare with the arrival of counter-terrorism has changed, and it's changed forever.
The demands on the individual of counter-terrorist training really became evident some years later when we had people coming down with post-traumatic stress syndrome. I think most of us at that time were suspicious of this, but as we saw more and more people coming down with it, and stronger people, we realised that the incredible pressure that these fellows were on, particularly in our killing house, where they're in there shooting hour after hour, day after day.
During that period, we also, a number of commanding officers took it upon themselves to lift the veil of secrecy to a point so that the people in Canberra who were wondering why the regiment was continually asking for substantial amounts of money for new equipment, for training, for other issues. They had the opportunity to come across and be shown what the regiment was capable of with no holds barred. And as second in command at the time, I remember a number of these senior visitors, both military and senior public servants, saying that if someone had shown us this before, we wouldn't be querying so much and taking so long as to why you wanted these substantial sums of money.
This period from 1979 through to the mid-80s was an incredible period of change in SAS. It was the foundation upon which the capabilities of today have been built. These skills, learnt on the counter-terrorist field of operations, have created the future.
SAS in the 1980s was almost wholly focused on counter-terrorism. And I guess this was reflective of wider policy at the time. We're pretty much focused on defence of Australia. So there was very little activity, if at all, overseas for SAS and indeed for the Australian Defence Force.
In 1987, in the arc of instability, a coup in Fiji by the mainly Polynesian army ousted the Fijian Indian majority government. The conflict was rooted in the disproportionate increase in the Indian population. SAS soldiers were positioned on Royal Australian Navy ships on standby below the main island of Viti Levu in case Australians needed to be evacuated. In the following year, 1988, Vanuatu troubled the Australian government when it turned away from Western influence in the Pacific and linked closely with Libya, a known state sponsor of terrorism responsible for the infamous Lockerbie Pan Am bombing. Again, SAS were put on alert, but again they weren't needed. For SAS soldiers hungry for action in the 1980s, solid overseas operations were simply not happening. But in the 1990s, the regiment's continued job hunting would reap some reward when SAS were given complex niche missions outside Australia. In these small but vital operations, small SAS groups would make a political and foreign policy impact out of all proportion to their size in a culture shift that would show SAS as a cost-effective tool of government foreign policy. But in the diversity of these niche operations, would SAS find its true path? Or would the regiment's search for meaning remain elusive?